Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back, depending on how long ago you have last seen me. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Essel Duff Cooper. I am an Aspec author and independent researcher, and I used to do a lot of videos on Aspec stuff. I kind of fell off that for a while and I'm trying to get back into it. So I figured why not start with a nice whopper of a video where I look at Aspec literature through the decades, a bird's eye overview. Yes, this is the bird's eye overview version, despite the fact that depending on how long I'm going to be talking, it is going to be anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour and 30 minutes. There's a lot. And I may not remember everything that I wanted to say. I may remember more things than I thought I would say. Who knows? I've practiced it a couple of times. And, you know, all that good stuff. Anyway, let's get to it. You also might end up seeing a cat in the background. I'm not quite sure. I think Sir Hiss is asleep right now. In a nice, quiet, dark corner. He likes those. But yeah, it helps if I am in here. I am still not used to doing PowerPoint presentations and recording them. Nope. Anyway, some notes before we get started, because notes are always important. So my own research focuses on science fiction and fantasy titles. Which means that the books that I'm about to mention and discuss are bigger titles in science fiction and fantasy adjacent circles. And other groups with a different focus may have slightly different books or very different books especially for certain eras. Then I would list here. It's basically it's what you know, which is very important. But yeah, in this case, there's also a reason why science fiction and fantasy is pretty dominant in the early contemporary sections. And that's basically because that's where the representation started, and it branched out from there into especially romance and young adult fiction. But you can find it basically anywhere if you look or know how or where to look. But the titles that we're going to look at are science fiction and fantasy heavy because that's my main field and my main source of knowledge right now. So, like I said, romance is also well represented, as it's also one of the key sites in which a lot of deliberate Aspec representation was written. So we're going to be very science fiction, fantasy, and romance heavy, and it's going to taper off into being more science fiction and fantasy heavy. This is also, and I cannot stress this enough, not a complete overview of every Aspec book ever. This is like a drop in the books that I know, and I have been out of the game of tracking Aspec books for a while, and there are even more that I don't know. Basically, what I'm trying to get at, and we'll get to in other points as well, is there is more than one single Aspec book out there, and there are many more canonical Aspec books out there than you need headcanon for. So just, there are a bunch of books. And I am so incredibly tired of people saying that these books do not exist. It is one of my main bugbears. It may be one of the reasons why I become a villain. I do understand why it happens, but it's just not true. There are a lot of books. Anyway, like I said, bugbear. Some of the books also may be out of print, which kind of sort of does not help the point that I have just been making, which is that we have a lot of books. It's just some of the books we have lost or may lose in future just because they go out of print. It can be for any reason. Like, I know there's one book which I haven't mentioned, which is out of print because the author passed away, from what I've been able to understand. And some others are no longer available because the publishers that had the rights to them folded, and the authors decided not to republish them. One great example of this would be Keeper of the Dawn by Diana Gunn, which is one of the earlier young adult science fiction and fantasy titles that with explicit asexual representation that we have. Can't find that online anymore. Or if you're very lucky, you might find it in a secondhand shop, because I do think it had a print edition. But good luck finding it. So those are some notes and caveats for the presentation in general. And let's just move on to the rest, because now we get to like the, table of contents, all that kind of stuff. What are we actually going to talk about? We'll get to the cool stuff now. So, topics. What even is Aspec? And other useful terms. So I imagine that, for a lot of people tuning into this video, you already know all these basics of what is Aspec, what do these terms mean. But, there's also a lot of people who still don't know, or who are not well versed in anything beyond like the very basics of what is asexual. So I figured that it would be a good idea to cover the rough basics of the main terms that I know are going to come up in this video. It's not a complete overview of every Aspec term ever. It's just the ones that are highly likely to come up in this discussion. And part of the reason why I did that is also just make sure that everybody is on the page with how I use those terms. Because we do still have like people using terms slightly differently. So it's just good and helpful to make sure that, you all know how I'm using these terms. For the most part, assuming that I don't mess up, which does occasionally happen. Still very common for people to do as well, just mess up the terms. Looking at you, academia. So yeah, and then we're just going to look at some other terms that, are useful to make sure that you know how I'm using them so you can get the most out of this video. Then we're going to look at traces and resonances in pre-modern literature of pretty much any age, which is we're going to look at some considerations when we're talking about historical literature, and we're talking about some early modern Aspec representation loosely. If you've not gathered it from the previous section where I defined like this is not my speciality, this area is not my speciality. But we can have some examples for it, and basically this is just to show like we do have these concepts and these ideas in early modern literature. There is stuff for us to look at, and why and how, some of that, and what are the pitfalls of doing them, all that kind of stuff is it's also very important. Then we're going to be talking about contemporary Aspec representation, which is we're finally getting there. I've divided this, as you can see, into 4 subsections: the 1970s to about the 1990s, the 2000s, 2010s, and the 2020s. And, then we have the final takeaway and wrap up, all that lovely good stuff. We also do that. So, without further ado, what even are these terms? Let's just go over them quickly, or at least as quickly as my nattering and rambling can. And we'll see how we go. So we have, again, cannot stress this enough, these are just the terms that are most likely to come up in what I'm about to say. And that's basically because very early representation is fairly broad and not very nuanced. So a lot of things don't come up. Like lithromantic is, you will get maybe a book here and there where a character is written as lithromantic or is specifically mentioned to be lithromantic. But they're very, very few and in between, and this is basically all the terms that we need to get the general overview. So, Aspec is an umbrella term for the asexual and aromantic spectra. It is shorthand for when both are relevant. So, and also for a lot of people when they don't want to be very precise. So, for example, I am demisexual, demiromantic, and that's a lot of characters, and I'm lazy. So I will very often say Aspec. I am an Aspec author. Part of that is also I don't write just demiromantic, demisexual characters. I also write aro ace characters and alloromantic ace characters and everywhere in between. So this just gives you an idea of, okay, I deal with the entire broad spectrum rather than everything. Whereas when it comes to identity, it's like, I don't necessarily want to give you all that detail, and I don't necessarily want to use all those characters. You have people who use it differently as well. So then we have asexual, which is someone who experiences little to no sexual attraction. Aromantic, which is someone who experiences little to no romantic attraction, which is interesting because You will have people who use both this label and specific micro labels. Like I may call myself asexual, but I may also call myself demisexual, and it kind of depends. I don't do this as much anymore because it muddles the waters. I tend to use Aspec when I want the umbrella term, because that opens up the term asexual to be a specific point on the spectrum. And then everybody knows what everybody's talking about instead of being confused and mixing up words. Again, looking at you, academia. Hopefully that's changed. It's looking a little bit like it's changed somewhat in recent years, but certainly early academia, especially when it's academia that looks at like that comes from like the psychology angle or the biology angle, they tend to use the term asexual, and they mean aromantic asexual specifically, except in the paragraphs where they don't, and they actually mean alloromantic asexual, depending on what works for their argument. And then you have a paper where you're using like 5 different definitions for the term that you're using, depending on the argument that you're making at the time, and it gets very confusing, and it leads to bad research. So please make sure that you are consistent in the terms that you use, and try to have an awareness of what term you're using when and why, because I guarantee it will help make everything a lot clearer. But yeah, so these are the current most well-known definitions. I may have gotten written slightly wrong. Definitions are weird to write for these terms, I've noticed. But this gives you roughly the idea that we're going with. So aroace is someone who is both asexual and aromantic, and I do, in this particular case, mean very specifically someone who is the best way to put this currently is still like the asexual, like that part of the spectrum, instead of like a gray sexual or demisexual, like the ace part of the spectrum, as well as the aromantic part of the spectrum, rather than, you know, spread out into different parts of the spectrum. We do very specifically mean those 2 points of no attraction of this kind. That's how I use it. You will get people who use it slightly differently still in you know, everyday conversation. You will still get people who say ace arrow because that is the priority that they want to give these orientations. Use the terms that people are using for those people. But for the purposes of this video, aroace means someone who is both asexual and aromantic, in terms of someone who experiences no sexual attraction and no romantic attraction. We also have allosexual and alloromantic, which I've kind of grouped together just to make the slide a little bit bigger and easier to read for people. But it's basically the same idea. It's someone who does experience sexual or romantic attraction, depending on whether, you know, the ending for it is sexual or romantic. We often shorten these to allo or alloro. And annoyingly, at the moment, allo can stand for allosexual, as well as allosexual and alloromantic, both wrapped into one. You see what I mean about needing terms that are nicely nuanced and different, because now we have to go and figure out what is what from context clues. And then we have demisexual, which is someone who experiences sexual attraction only after an emotional bond is formed. This one comes up mostly in romance, but we'll get to that. We also have the types of representation, and if you skipped like the previous section because you want to skip all the you know, definitions and you got to this one, please don't skip this one, because this might be information that you don't know or that is significantly different from how you sort representation. So types of representation, for my purposes and the purposes of this video, we have 4. We have word of God representation, incidental representation, implied representation, and explicit representation. So word of God representation is representation that exists solely because the creator said a character fits that marginalization. It's kind of complicated. A lot of them overlap a lot of the time, But in this case, it's think of a character like a minor character, and the only examples I can think of on short notice are ones that I don't want to use because they are that franchise. But oh, here we go. This did not happen, but say for example that Tolkien lived in contemporary times and it was like, well, Frodo is asexual. And there's nothing really in the text that kind of indicates that, as far as I remember. It's also not the point, but the point is there's nothing really in a text to hang that on, but beyond what the creator says. This very often is combined with incidental or implied representation as well. So it's, again, we have overlap in these. It's not like 4 different categories and we're done. So incidental representation is representation that is unintentional. However, it is depicted on page, it's just not labeled or named. This may include headcanon from a lot of readers who all are like, oh, but this character is so definitely Aspec coded. Sherlock Holmes is probably a very good example for that. That could be unintentional representation depending on how you read it. This may be confirmed by word of God, like one of the examples we're going to see is going to be Tamora Pierce. And Tamora Pierce wrote incidental representation. And when she learned that, you know, asexuality and aromanticism existed, she went, oh, yes, actually, that fits this character. So this character, yes, you can say they fit there. And then you have word of God for incidental representation that, you know, was not intentional. In this case specifically because the author didn't know. But is that kind of representation. Implied representation is very, very similar. The only difference is that in this case, the author very much did deliberately do this. This is the most common type of representation we have nowadays. And one of the ways we can kind of sort of tell incidental and implied representation apart is by looking at the marketing. Because implied representation is very often included in the marketing. So, for example, My A Promise Broken has an Arrow Ace main character, the Dragonist. This is shown on page, but there's no name, there's no label, it's not explicit. It is, however, deliberate. And I will therefore occasionally market it as having an Arrow Ace character in it. There's a difference. If it was incidental, then I wouldn't do that because, you know, it would be an accident. You could get like readers who are like, well, oh, but I really, you know, connect to that because, you know, my identity and stuff. Very valid, not quite the same. Explicit representation is representation that is explicitly named or labeled on page. So this is a representation where you have a character going, yay, I'm asexual, go asexuals, and all that kind of stuff. Or it can be a case of, I don't understand why I do not want this, and then another character goes, well, maybe you're asexual. And then they look at it and they go, oh, yes, that fits. So it's that kind of representation. In this case, specifically for this video as well, this does include made-up fantasy terms that have clear links or definitions for asexuality. Or aromanticism. Mostly it's asexuality, though. And this is because this is very explicit in some ways. It's debatable. Like, there are people who will absolutely disagree with me putting this in explicit representation because it's not a character going, oh, well, I'm asexual in the text. They will be going like, oh, I am floobity-goop. I made that up on the go, obviously. But in that case, it is very often intended to deal with these concepts. It's just because of the tendency for especially fantasy books to not like very modern terms, like asexual. Authors kind of often choose not to use them. They make up their own term. And readers can get very, very angry if you do include these terms. Readers have been very angry with me for including these explicit terms in medieval fantasy settings. They don't like it because it's anachronistic. So in this case, I am counting them because it is pretty much intended to be explicit. It is just wrapped up in a way that, readers will not balk at. So your mileage may vary, but this is why I'm doing it and why we're doing it here. So now that we have established what I'm talking about and how these terms work, let's go look at some traces and resonances in pre-modern literature of any age. And I do mean any. Before that, fun fact, we are actually going to look at some considerations when talking about these books because A, I am a nerd, and B, kind of important. So, quick and dirty overview of our Aspec history first, which is basically 2 important times in our history, and some cool nerdy stuff because I cannot stress enough, I am a nerd. So we have 2001. This is when Avon was created by David J. And it is also kind of allegedly when the term asexual was coined. It's more likely to have been asexuality specifically. But people tend to mix them together and get confused. And a lot of the time, I have seen people claim that is the term asexual that was coined. It was not. It was in use in the 70s and 80s as well. It's complicated. But we do start to see like asexuality becoming more visible from this point onward. It is starting to get so many people together that, people realize that there is something here. At this point in time in 2001, the term asexual also means something like someone who does not experience sexual attraction or desire. Throughout the 20s, throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, certainly, whenever you had like these outlets talking about asexuality and like introducing it and what it is, a lot of the times the definition that they used was someone who does not experience sexual desire. We pushed back on that pretty hard, and we have now changed the definition to something that is more inclusive of the entire spectrum and how everything works. But this is important because way back in 1896, Magnus Hirschfeld, yes, that Hirschfeld, published a pamphlet called Sappho and Socrates, and he did that under a pseudonym. And in this pamphlet, he describes a scale of sexual attraction that incorporates the concepts of this lack of attraction, so the concept of asexuality in general. He also gives this concept a label. He gives it a name, anesthesia sexualis, which in translation means something like no sexual desire whatsoever. You can see where the definition no sexual desire whatsoever overlaps with someone who does not experience sexual desire. They are basically the same thing, just worded differently. This matters because a lot of people want to argue that our history starts at 2001, and it kind of really doesn't. It starts at the beginning of sexuology history as a term, as a field. So, again, I am a nerd. The next 2 slides are going to be very nerdy. If you are not into nerdiness, skip those. So, I wanted to show this off. Apologies to everybody who cannot read German or Fraktur, or both. Because I am not going to read the entire thing. But this is page 6 from the pamphlet Sappho und Socrates. And I highlighted the bit where it says, asexuality, the concept of it. So, es gibt Individuen mit gar nicht vorhandenen geschlechtlichen Begehren, anesthesia sexualis. So, there are individuals who have absolutely no sexual desires. And then he goes on to explain that some people have like too much sexual desire, like hypersexuality. But for our purposes, it's the bit that I highlighted that's important. He also, as I promised you a scale, he did a scale. So let's see if I can get like a laser pointer, because that helps, because again, this is all in Fraktur. So this is pretty much the next page. So we have here kind of whether you're attracted, and how strong. I keep wanting to put these on different scales because I keep wanting treating this as one scale. I think that's how it works. I'm not sure. But we have a lovely scale and you can like point on it. Like if you are demisexual, you could say that you're, for example, cult. Which my German is terrible when I'm talking English apparently. But so that would be a 3. And then for men, you know, maybe you're like homo-romantic, demisexual, and you're a dude and it's very strong but cold, then you would be over here. Which again, I'm not quite sure that's how it works, but you can have a scale. And you can kind of fit the romantic attraction on here as well, I think, fairly easily. But as a fun fact in queer history, it would be another 79 years until the year 1948 before we got a more well-known scale, and that would be the Kinsey scale. So we can see that this is already more detailed than the Kinsey scale, and we don't need an X for asexuality because we can just be right over here. You can just sit over here in this corner, or rather this corner here. You can kind of sit there if you want to. So that's really cool. That's why I wanted to show it off, because it's fun, and a lot of people don't know this bit of history, and I was like, I have an excuse to use this, so I will. So let's move on to some anachronistic definitions and some of the issues with those. It's a very common thing in queer theory, very well discussed thing in queer theory that I desperately need a better grounding in. But so for our purposes in this particular video is the idea that, you know, humans engage with sexuality and romantic attraction differently across cultures as well as across time. So someone from one culture may be like, well, kissing someone on the lips briefly is not in any way romantic, and they'll be fine and have no problem with that. And someone from a different culture might be like, oh, but that is so super romantic. You literally cannot do that unless it's your romantic partner. So you have them mismatched there. And you have that across time as well, especially because across time, you run into the situation where people don't have these modern terms because those terms did not exist in their lifetime. So related to that, calling a pre-modern character, or potentially worse, a real person, ace or aromantic, or pretty much anywhere on any kind of marginalized spectrum, definitively as if, you know, this is 100% true and they would agree with it, is anachronistic because we don't know. And this can be used both ways to, you know, attack marginalized people. It is very common to use, yeah, but you can't do that, to attack trans people specifically, for example. But basically, we need nuance and we need, you know, care and attention when we talk about historical texts, basically. There's also a point where if you look at text through just the lens of identity, like, is this character Aspec or not, you lose out on everything that is related to these concepts that may be explored in books where the characters are not explicitly Aspec. So we're not looking for characters who are going, yeah, I'm Ace or I'm Arrow. We're not looking for those. We're looking for books and narratives that have traces or resonances to challenge the existing social structures and social ideas around sexuality and romantic ideals. And this enriches the field substantially, and it makes it much easier to have fruitful and useful conversations about these characters. That even holds true today when we do have a lot of characters that specifically fall under these umbrella terms. So now that we know all that, let's go look at some early modern Aspec representation. Again, not my field, will not be able to tell you a lot about this, but I do want to geek out a little bit, and I want to show what is possible if we are willing to consider the fact that these concepts and ideas that, you know, Aspec people deal with were also things that people dealt with in other times. They just dealt with it in different ways and through a different lens. So arguably, some of the oldest examples that we can find are the different types of love in ancient Greek societies. Like we have agape, philia, we have four more, and I don't remember them off the top of my head. But arguably, there is something there for people to look at if they want to study Aspec ideas and concepts in classic times. We don't see a lot of that. We'll get to that in a little bit. You will also note that this is a very small list. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. So some examples that we have are the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which is assumed to be published in the late 1430s. We have Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory from 1485, where we do have a nice, really, really cool essay by Megan Arkenberg that looks at the Galahad quest in Le Morte d'Arthur from an Aspec lens. It's really cool. If you like Arthuriana, if you like queer Arthuriana and queer literature in general, definitely go look it up. It's so good. We also have William Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis in 1593. This is, I believe it's Simone Chess that looked at this one specifically. And I think it was mostly for aromanticism, but I'm not quite sure. And if I've read Venus and Adonis by Shakespeare, then I've forgotten literally everything about it. But it does come up in asexuality and aromanticism studies for pre-modern times. We also have, and this is one I read fairly recently, is Margaret Cavendish's The Description of a New World called The Blazing World, which is from 1666. This is more commonly known nowadays as The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish. And you're not going to find a lot of Aspec resonances in this, but I wanted to shout it out because it is probably the very earliest text I have found where someone uses the term platonic lovers in a way that potentially could be seen as relating to modern queer platonic relationships. So, platonic relationships, but make them queer. So, they may or may not be romantic. They may or may not include sexual relationships. We don't. It's a very broad term. But we can find traces of that in that text, potentially. We certainly have words in there that we can see how well they fit, and, we can do puzzle stuff with that. So that's really cool. So if you want to read more about pre-modern literature in this case, you should look up the work by Eliza Blake, Simone Chess, Melissa Sanchez, Ali O'Mara, and the aforementioned Megan Arkenberg. I don't know how much Megan Arkenberg is doing in Aspec spaces, but that one is there. These are academics who are very much working in these spaces. And there are many more, but this will give you a starting point. So, why are there so few titles for such a long period? Because at the shortest, we are going from 1430 to 1970. That's like 500 years. So why are there only like 5 titles? Well, the short answer to this is we just don't have the research. Asexuality and aromanticism studies, which is in academia generally called asexualities studies, did not exist prior to roughly 2012. So we have Anthony Bogart, who is kind of sort of seen as, the kind of father for asexuality studies. The first earliest studies we have is his asexuality prevalence and associated factors in a national probability sample from 2004. And he then expanded on that research to a 2012 book, Understanding Asexuality, which is where asexuality started to get visible outside of internet communities. So they kind of started to come into existence around 2012. And another major book in this development would be Julie Sondra Decker's 2004 publication of The Invisible Orientation, An Introduction to Asexuality, This is a pop science work that looks at the ways that asexual communities talk about asexuality, as well as, if I recall correctly, to some extent, a little bit on aromanticism as well. Is very thorough, especially given the year. And I'm going to need to pause for a second. Be right back. You will not notice. My apologies for this delay that you will not notice. Also for the fact that I'm now slightly distracted. But I have two cats that were fighting and I had to break them apart. So let's move on. Well, it helps if I am in the proper space to contemporary Aspec representation, which again is my field and which I will have vastly more to say about than the previous section. So again, we have divided this into the 1970s to the 1990s, the 2000s to 2010s, and the 2020s. And it's absolutely fascinating to me that we can fit these later decades into actual decades. That's pretty cool. Again. So, hey, there we go. It refused to switch over for some reason. So from the 1970s to the 1980s and the 1990s, we have a couple of titles. So some of these are going to be more Aspec adjacent than others. Gail Jones's Corregidora is a very good example of that. But I did want to mention it because they are very clear Aspec themes in this book that were touched on in 1975. We then move on to Tanith Lee's The Silver Medal Lover, which was published in 1981. And again, is more dealing with Aspec themes than actual pretending to be any kind of Aspec representation. But you can read this and you can be like, oh, this resonates with me. So these two are traces. But they are not necessarily deliberate representation or, implied deliberate representation. We do get that with Carrie Holmes' Bone People, which is the 1985 Booker Prize winner. This is also widely considered one of the first explicitly, deliberately asexual books that we have. It also deals with a lot of other stuff, but that is basically what it's known for. In 1988, we have Mercedes Lackey's The Oathbound, which was followed by two other books in this series, Oathbreakers and Oathblood. You can see that there is a almost 10-year gap between the latter two. It was also followed by a related book, which I think was one of the main characters' children, but the main characters also show up and have kind of a bit of an epilogue to these main three books. This is one of the first times in which we see the word asexual used in a book. It's in Oathbound at the very start in the introduction. We can also find it in, the glossary section with the conlang. You can also find it there as well. We have Elizabeth Moon's The Sheep Farmer's Daughter, Divided Allegiance, and Oath of Gold. Why is By the Sword there? Huh. Well, okay, so I have to see if I can fix that with a pen, because I haven't... Where's my pen? So, this one. Circle it. Should be over here. Write this book out. I can sort of. So, By the Sword, which I put by Elizabeth Moon, is actually by Mercedes Lackey. I don't know how I missed that one, but there we go. We all make mistakes. Anyway, Elizabeth Moon's Sheep Farmer's Daughter, Divided Legions, and Oath of Gold is a 1980s trilogy better known as The Deed of Paxenarian. This does not use the term specifically, if I recall correctly, but it is very clear and very deliberate. We also have The Firestone by Tanya Huff, which again, we don't necessarily have the word used. I don't remember. It's been a very long time since I read this one. But we have very clear and deliberate representation. We also start to see something that is going to come up a bit later in decades past, or decades forward, which is polyamory. We have Catherine Liska Kimbriel's Night Calls from 1996, which is remarkable because it's actually Word of God demisexual representation. All of the others here are aro ace, except that one. We have Carolyn Ives Gilman Halfway Human in 1989, and David Drake's With Lightnings in 1998 as well. So these also specifically use the words aro ace. So this is just an outtake. There are more, but they're going to be really hard to find. And they're kind of going to be buried in books that have themes that deal with it that may or may not make any sense to include. Thousand Night of Strangers, I think it is, which has themes, but it didn't feel right to include them on these slides, for example. Not for these purposes anyway. So the types of representation that we find in these books tends to be incidental, implicit, or explicit. The characters tend to be main or central characters. Asexuality and aromanticism tends to be plot relevant, if not plot driving. There are a couple of exceptions to this. As I mentioned, they're almost exclusively aro ace depictions. And interestingly enough, they usually do not rely on using harmful stereotypes. Your mileage may vary on that, just because this is a small outtake, but in my experience, books from this period fall under roughly these points. Like, this is what you can expect if you pick up a book from the 1980s or 1990s that someone says has Aspec representation or resonates with Aspec characters and ideas. This is roughly what you can expect. So the 2000s, we get more or less the same, to be honest. So you can see that I have far fewer examples for this one as well. So we have Tamora Pierce's Page, Squire, and Lady Knight, which, if you know Tamora Pierce's work, and we covered her a little bit earlier, you will know that these are 3 books in the Protector of the Small series, and the first book, First Test, published in 1999, is not included on either slide. I did this very deliberately because First Test does not really deal with any kind of Aspec ideas that I remember. It's mostly found in these latter 3 books. And as I mentioned earlier, this is very definitely incidental representation. Tamora Pierce, when she learned that asexuality and aromanticism existed, has put a section in her frequently asked questions on our website that she would write Caladri as ace and probably also aromantic today if she was writing this series today. So given that we have a conscientious author who is like, this was incidental representation, but yes, these resonates are here, therefore I agree with it, I was like, I'm gonna leave the first book off. Also, it splits book series up into 2 areas, and I don't necessarily like that. It doesn't really work for me. Not with the representation with these books in the way that it is, to be honest. We also have Joe Walton's The King's Peace and The King's Name from 2000 and 2001. The 3rd book in the series is not included here because that is a prequel that does not deal with Sulian, and the Aspec incidental representation in this book is very, very specifically the Sulian duology that is made up by The King's Peace and The King's Name. We also have Elizabeth Bear's Dust, which was republished in 2015 as Pinion, as well as Laura Ann Gilman's Flesh and Fire, which was published in 2009. Both these series continue publishing in the 2010s. So we could put those books on the 2010s. I would be slightly more comfortable doing that with the Jacob Slatter's books by Elizabeth Bear with Dust / Pinion, because that one has word use representation in it, but I haven't read those later books, so I am not quite sure what is going to go on with them. So it's like, I'm just going to leave them off for now, but they do exist, and you should know they exist. So again, the types of representation that we find in these books tends to be incidental, implicit, and explicit, and not so much word of God. The only exception to that would really be, Tamora Pierce's book, where the incidental has word of God on top of it. Again, all of the characters I just mentioned, all of these books have main characters or central characters that fall under the Aspec potential. They are, again, experiences that are plot relevant but may not be driving the plot forward. All of these are Arrow Ace. Yes, even Caladri, even though Caladri is one of the most nuanced examples in young adult fiction that we have, she does land on not interested in romance and not interested in sexual, contact. So we put her on our Arrow Ace as well. These books usually do not rely on stereotypes. It's the early 2000s. You might find some here and there that do. But it's not as common as it is going to become in the next decade. There are reasons for this. But yeah, so we're moving on to 2010s, where we get a lot of indie books as well. So be prepared. This next slide is a long one. There you go. It's a long one. I can't even read it if I look at my tiny screen. Well, it's not tiny, it's a normal screen, but the other one is like massive. So I'm going to look away to my main monitor so I can actually read what everything says. So in the 2010s, we have on the, where is my thingy? That's the left-hand side, right? Yeah, that's the left-hand side. So on the left-hand side, we have everything that is 100% very definitely traditionally published. And here we have indie publications and some smaller traditional publishing that may be so small or so niche that they basically fall under like the small press indie rather than, the self-published situation. And I could have subdivided these further because this is where a lot of the Aspec representation starts to really come into its own. This is when we start to get to a point where asexuality has been so visible in certain spheres that people are like, I am going to write this representation deliberately. Or not. Sometimes it's not. So we have, for example, Karen Healy's Guardian of the Dead, which is published in 2010, which has a major asexual and aromantic side character. At least I think it's both. It might just be asexual. It's the 2010s. There is overlap between using the word asexual as in just meaning asexual, and the romantic orientation can be anything, as well as using asexual to mean aromantic asexual. It gets complicated very quickly, which again is why nuance when you're talking about these identities is so important. So we have Sherwood Smith's Banner of the Damned, which is 2000. I thought it was 2012, but apparently it's 2013. Might also be 2012. And I wrote it down wrong. But it's one of those 2 years. It's not later. Which has a lovely word used kind of definition. It's just, a conlang word used, like for fantasy setting reasons. We have R.J. Anderson's Quicksilver, which is also 2013. There is a lovely discussion that R.J. Anderson did on the Book Smugglers that you can still find online, where Anderson talks about the research that was done into writing our main character Tori, who is asexual, and what that entailed. We also see something that leads into a very interesting point, which is we are learning how to write asexual people. And in this case, this is an Arrow Ace character up until about the final 1 or 2 chapters of the book, where it's like, oh, we're going to shoehorn a romance in here that was not built up in any way in the rest of the book. And especially if you look at authors looking for traditional representation in the books in this era, you will find anecdotes of authors talking about how editors wanted to put romance into their Arrow Ace narratives to make them sell better. So there's shenanigans going on in publishing at this point. This is not the only bit of shenanigans that is going on. We also have Garth Nix's Clariel, which is 2014 and very controversial. But again, it's, implicit representation. It has words used. They call it a singleton. So it goes on this particular list. It's also one of the biggest titles that we have, honestly. We have Scott Westerfeld's Afterworlds, same year. This is demisexual representation. That is mostly Word of God demisexual representation. We have Nicole Corner-Stace's Archivist Wasp, 2015, which is one of the very early, very specifically aromantic books that we have. Most of these are asexual or demisexual. We have Every Heart a Dory by Shanna Maguire, which is kind of seen as one of the first major asexual books in science fiction and fantasy, certainly. But it's one of the first times that a book got a lot of visibility that uses the term asexual as we would use it today. It's a very, very important text in Aspec history. We have Alice Oseman's Radio Silence from 2016, which, yes, fun fact, there is asexual representation in Oseman's books before Loveless. Which is really cool and really interesting. And please stop just referring to Loveless when you talk about asexual representation, because even the author of that book has more. Again, this is specifically demisexual, but it is on-page word representation. We have, I'm not going to go over all of them in detail because we will be here forever. We have Kalisa Lynn's We Awaken, Megan Erickson's Overexposed in 2016. This one I will pick out because this one has explicit word use for demisexual, and this is not a demisexual book. This is Lust at First Sight meets Gay for You, which is when you have a character who, prior to this, you have reasons to believe that they may be attracted to to another gender, but then they meet like their love interest who is the same gender, and they're like, I am in love with you, and I want to have a relationship with you, and that's it. There is no discussion of any kind of bisexuality or anything. And in the mid-2010s, it was very, very, very common for a demisexual romance to be very specifically used to kind of say, oh yes, but this is not that particular trope because my character is demisexual, and the fact that these characters literally just met and there is no emotional bond. The one thing that is necessary for a demi relationship is an existing emotional bond. It did not matter. It was very blatant. It was very annoying. I'm very glad we moved on beyond that, but this is something to keep in mind for demisexual representation from the 2010s. You need to be very careful because a lot of it is very, very, very queer-phobic. We have Elise Springer's Thaw, 2017. Catherine Ormsby's Tash Hotz Tolstoy. Claire Collins' Let's Talk About Love, which I want to highlight is probably one of the first, I think it's actually the first explicitly asexual book by a Black author with a Black heroine, Black main character in the book. It's really cool. It got a lot of flack that honestly, just before it came out and when it came out, that is completely unjustified. So if you're looking at this and like, oh, but I recognize it and people would not recommend it because you really don't remember, check it out anyway. It's a good book. It's an important book as well. So just want to throw that out there. We have R.F. Kuang's The Poppy Wars, Rosie Thor's Tarnished Out the Stars, Lisa Jen Bigelow's Hazel's Theory of Evolution, which I believe is the first middle grade book we have with explicit asexual representation. We have C.B. Lee's Not Your Sidekick, Not Your Villain, and Not Your Backup. The fourth book has not been published yet, unfortunately. May not be published, I guess, given the time frame, but who knows. Hopefully will at some point. So all of these are, existing books. We can divide them into books with Aspec with arrow ace representation, which would be things like Every Heart a Doorway, Archivist Wasp, Clariel Quicksilver. We can do that. We can divide them into demisexual representations, so Afterworlds, Overexposed. In those, we have Aspec Romance, which is where we start to see a lot of these stereotypes. And mostly we start to see these stereotypes because Aspec authors are discovering what these stereotypes are and want to explicitly push against them. Or okay, it's also that also possible is we have Aspec authors who grew up being like, I am broken, this is not normal, I am not normal, there is something wrong with me. Discovering the word asexuality or asexual and being like, oh, I am actually not broken. I am going to write a book to show people that they are not broken so that they do not have to go through the thing that I went through. So we get a bunch of books that are very heavy on negative stereotypes, not because we don't know any better. We do have some in there where it's like it's just bad representation for the sake of bad representation, for the sake of having representation and not really bothering to do anything well. But a lot of this is Aspec authors who are learning how to write Aspec characters with deliberation and nuance, who also want to look at all these harmful stereotypes that they grew up with to be like, hey, this is wrong, we shouldn't do this, there is nothing wrong with us. So we get a lot of harmful stereotypes in books that may not necessarily age very well, but there's very good reasons for them, and you know, we should keep that in mind when we read those books, because they're not there to like be hurtful. They're there for the very opposite reason of, hey, I see you, I understand you, there is nothing wrong with you. Oh, should not knock the microphone. Thankfully it's not the microphone that I'm using. We also have the indie books, which is where a lot of the nuance and the how to write Aspec characters comes from. So we have Lauren Jankowski's Sarah from the Green, which was originally published in 2013, had a very rough history there that has been more or less scrubbed from the internet. And it was republished in 2017, to the point where this is the original publication date that you can find. It's very fascinating and probably not something people really want to look into because this would still be more visible then. We also have Roanna Silver's Chameleon Moon. If you want a very good early example of looking at Aspec stereotypes in a way that wants to punch them in the teeth, this is a very good book to do that. This also has multiple Aspec characters in there. Claudia Ossano's Viral Airwaves is similar. I think that doesn't necessarily have that much representation. It's been a while since I read that. But literally everything else Claudia wrote or has written has included more, you know, nuance and very, very many different flavors of Aspec in one book. So, you know, if you want multiple characters that are on different parts of the spectrum, this is a very good author to look at. We have Lisa Chiavari's Fourth World by in 2015. Which I think is one of the first young adults romance Aspec books with two Aspec characters out there that are technically going to be a mixed attraction couple, because one is arrow ace and one is demisexual. But yeah, it's one of the earliest ones. It's one of the first ones I found as well, which is really cool. We have Mine, A Promise Broken. We've already discussed that one. We have Michelle Khan's No More Heroes, which again has a lot of different representation in it, even though a lot of it is currently in this book more Word of God. Heather Rose Jones, The Mystic Marriage. Anna J. Phoenix, The Alpha and His Ace. Annabeth Albert's All Night Long. Darietta Four's The Trouble, which is very remarkable because this is one of the earliest explicitly aromantic non-romance books that exists, because aromantic, but we will find it discussed in romance circles, because the plot is so tied up with romance plots. We have Lillian Bodley's The Loveless Princess. I think this one has is no longer in print, but this one and we're going to skip this one for now. Murder of a Working Ghost are two examples of authors who are very, very, very determined and trying to deal with Aspec stereotypes by going, no, they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong, in a way that may be hard to read for modern readers, because we have more nuanced representation now and we don't need to hammer on these negative stereotypes as much as we need it in this period. We have Poland Blake's Were Cockroach, which they are working on a sequel to this book, which I'm very much looking forward to. But again, multiple types of representation are in here, which is very common in the indie sphere at this point, is we get multiple types and multiple characters in one book. We have Katie Simkis's Learning Curves and Abby Silver's Two Dark Moons, which again has a lot of allosexual aromantic representation. That is still pretty rare to this day. So lots of important books there. But there's a lot. And then we come to the, oh no, sorry, I am silly. We are coming to the types of representation found in kind of like a sort of format summary. So here we find more word of God representation from people who were writing characters where they look back on it, oh, this is asexual, aromantic to me, and they're like, so this is definitely in there. And your mileage may vary on how easily you find that to see. We also get this for side characters, where people are finding some overlap and they're mentioning like this is word of God, or it can be implicit, but it's very, very minor. We have implicit representation, we have explicit representation, we technically also have incidental, but we are starting to see far more implicit and explicit representation in this era. We are starting to see characters in any role. This is partially because people are looking for representation and they are taking everything and anything they can. So Karen Healy from Guardian of the Dead, this was a book that was included in a lot of early lists with Aspec representation, and I think in the mid-2010s maybe the post got taken down. Karen Healy was like, hey, please stop including my book on these lists because there are much better books that you can include. And you don't need like this minor character, it's actually like a side character, they're not that minor, written by someone who isn't asexual. Go include major characters with asexual representation that are written by authors who understand what they're writing about because it's their lived experience, kind of that vibe. Karen Healy has very recently confirmed that this is still her stance. And at this point, I kind of mostly agree, except there are times where you really definitely want to include this book in your lists like this one, because it's, you know, historically relevant. But we are seeing books like that get included when it's very minor, maybe one sentence representation for like a tertiary character, because it was representation that was deliberate and people found it and we didn't know how much else there was and how to find it. So we took what we could get. But mostly all of the characters I mentioned are major roles. They are, at worst, they are secondary characters with a fair amount of screen time. We are starting to see characters where the Aspec experiences are plot relevant and very often plot driving experiences if they're in a major role. This is partially because a lot of the representation that we are starting to see is either dealing with, you know, these stereotypes that we mentioned, or they're romances and we're trying to figure out how to write Aspec romances in particular, where we start to see, I believe, don't pin me on this, it's been a very long time since I specifically looked at Aspec romance, is we start off mostly with polyamorous romance. And we get into romance where we have mixed orientations. We have asexual and an allosexual character who come in together. And basically we get one of those kind of sacrifices what's important to them to make their partner happy. So we have allosexuals who are like, even though, you know, sex is really important to me, you don't want to do this, therefore we will not do this. And in the polyamorous version, they very often have an asexual and an allosexual partner so that they can have both. And we also have, you know, the opposite, where we have an asexual character who discovers, well, hey, actually, I don't think sex is that bad as long as it's with you, the partner whom I love. We get that, and we don't necessarily get a lot of discussion or nuance in this yet. But that is kind of where we end up, and also we have a lot of demisexual romances. So, and then it's about discovering demisexuality, because a lot of them are more leaning into gay for you, where you get one mention of, oh, hey, you're demisexual, aren't you? And that's all you get. But we're starting to see alloromantic aces and demisexual characters in more detail. We are also starting to see more aromantic characters, but still not to the point where it's like, okay, I'm going to include it on this slide. 90% of it is going to be alloromantic ace versus aromantic ace and demisexual. That's going to be most of it. And traditional publishing especially is where we find these harmful stereotypes in ways that we may or may not be poking at them. Indie publications makes it less likely, does not make it impossible. This is basically a decade where people are trying to figure out how to write Aspec characters, and some people get it very right very early on, and some people may not. Some people may deliberately not. There's a lot going on in this era. You could subdivide this into multiple bits very easily, as I said. And again, we are at 1 hour and 7 minutes, so you can see why I did not do that. So let's just move on and try to make sure that we stay beneath 1 hour and 30 minutes. Let's move on to today. The thing I have learned that is absolutely unrelated to these videos is that I absolutely abhor having to pause them to check on things. So for those of you who heard anything, which is probably no one, if you did hear anything, I had to go check on why people were yelling, and the reason why people were yelling is there is football on. Which is very annoying, because if nothing else, even if it doesn't get picked up by the audio, it very disrupts my thought processes. I am very sensitive to noise and pick it up a lot and very easily. This is not fun. Anyway, we were looking at the 2020s and we're trying to make it before the 1 hour 30 mark. So let's look at what the state is today. And before I go to the next slide, I want to put in one caveat, which is that early on in the 2020s, I kind of fell off tracking them. So there is a whole bunch that I do not know about. And please don't hesitate to drop anything you think is related in the comments, because I would love to hear it, even if I've heard of it before, because I am still catching up. At least it feels like I'm still catching up on a lot of stuff in the 2020s that I missed. So, nope, still need to be here. 2020s. So, I want to see if you can spot a pattern in these texts. Not that, you know, I have a classroom in front of me and can check with people, but just for your own purposes, see if you can spot a pattern in a bunch of these. So in the 2020s, we have Common Bonds, which is written by various authors because it's an anthology. It is the very first aromantic queer anthology that, for science fiction and fantasy at least, that we have. And I think actually just in general, it's the very first one. It was edited by Claudia Arsenault, C.T. Callahan, B.R. Sanders, and Roanne Silver. Roanne Silver, they recently finished a crowdfunding for the 3rd volume in Common Bonds, and they published the 2nd earlier this year, which is really cool. We also have books like Darcy Littlebatcher's Ella Zoe, Lindsay Miller's Belle Revolte, K.B. Wagger's A Pale Light in the Black, Cedar McCloud's The Thread That Binds, Alicia Dow's The Sound of Stars, Alice Osman's Loveless. We have Margaret Owen's Little Thieves, Painted Devils, and Holy Terrors. This is one trilogy. As well as T.G. Clune's In the Lives of Puppets. John Wiswell, Someone You Can Build a Nest In. Jules Arbeau, Lord of the Empty Isles. Sylvie Cathrall's A Letter to the Luminous Deep and A Letter from the Lonesome Shore. Jasmine Wall's The Traitor and the Wretch. I keep thinking it's The Traitor and the Wrench, and it's not. I don't know why my brain does that. It's Vanessa Ricci Tho's The Dragon Next Door, Bethany Laurel's Balances, Julian Wills' Lost First Kiss, and Cody Digel Orience's Love Looks Like Lola, and many, many, many more. So there are two things of note on this slide. The first one is most of these are traditionally published books. This is not because indie books stopped publishing. It's just because I looked at the previous slide and saw how long it was and kind of went, well, a lot of these indie authors are still publishing, and, you know, I'm not going to put all of them on these slides again, because you can look them up very easily and discover that, hey, these authors are still publishing a lot of books. Cedar McCloud and Claudia Arsenault have both published new books this year. Also, so have I. So there's overlap there and carry through. And if they are newer indie authors, then I may also not know about them to the same extent, which is not a failing on these authors, or, it's a failing on me. Most of the ones I know in this period are just traditionally published books, so that's on me. The other thing to point out on this slide specifically is look at how many are from 2020. That is like basically half of everything that is on here is from the 2020s. And then COVID happened and publishing happened, and we're still sorting through all of that. It's not unrelated. It's also not related. It's a thing that, people could look at if they want to study that correlation between why we had so many books in 2020 and then we kind of drop off some. We get some more major titles in like 2024, Every Heart a Doorway, which was from 2016, for example, got like every single major science fiction and fantasy award you could get. And we don't really see that again until Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell, who also has a new Aspec book, or a book with Aspec characters, coming out this year. We have Margaret Owen's Little Thieves, Painted Devils, Holy Terrors, which is also up for a major award this year. And things go on like that. So it goes up and down. And the one thing to point out is Cody Digel Orience's Love Looks Like Lola. This is the very first Aspec picture book that we have. And from the sound of it, I need to go pause again. I am very sorry. I will be right back. I know you will not notice, but still. So I have, in the interim, just, jumped over to the next slide. So what does the representation look like in the 2020s? Well, basically, we still have pretty much every type of representation that we can find. Mostly this seems to be word of God, implicit or explicit, with implicit and explicit being the most common. We are starting to see way more varied representation across the board. The books I just highlighted, they all have major or central Aspec characters. We are starting to see more a romantic representation that is independent of a sexual representation. Like we've seen from the previous slides, we do have some in these periods. There may be more that I just don't know. But in the 2020s, we are starting to see them far more often. We're also starting to see more exploration of micro-labels and nuance, even when the representation in it, like the rep, is implicit rather than explicit. So we are starting to see way more differences in there. Stereotypes are handled with sensitivity and care, if they're included at all, which sounds like the previous 10 years people did not handle stereotypes with sensitivity and care. They did. It is just they also, as I tried to hammer on, had a very strong desire to kind of beat those stereotypes to death, which means that they are far less subtle and far more potentially harmful than the stereotypes are in the books that we see in the 2020s. And we are halfway through the 2020s, so who knows where this is going to go in a couple of years. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think. But so we are now in the 2020s. We are starting to see far more diverse representation. We are also, I think, in the later 2020s, starting to see a little bit of a drop in traditional publishing for these representation, and a uptick again in indie publications. But it's more like the indie publications were always there for the most part. It's just, it looks like an uptick because traditional publishing may be down a little bit. So it's very, very confusing and interesting, and we'll see how it develops. And then we are finally at the wrap up. Thank you so much for sticking with me so long. Let's go do the wrap up, and I will try to make this fairly quick. I will also actually be in here so I can move it. So what are some final takeaways from this entire long video? So we can find these traces and resonances of asexual and aromantic experiences throughout history. They're just not labeled that way, and you need to treat them with a little bit of care to make sure that you're not putting words onto something where they don't belong. We can see that stories that use modern concepts have been around since at least the 1980s, technically more like the 1970s, but that was one book, whereas the 80s, as you saw, had multiple. So that's generally where I kind of put the start of Aspec representation, also because that's when The Bone People was published. And there we have a nice major point. Oh, the dog. I hope nobody heard that, but there was a dog barking. I've been trying so hard to get through this without interruptions, and it just never works. Anyway, so the most nuanced representation is still found in indie publications, which is basically just there's more freedom in indie publications than there is in traditional publication. So you get more freedom to include micro labels and bits of identity and ideas that may not be what a commercial editor wants, but which readers very much want. And then you might go indie. We can also see that stories have gone through a period where they were writing stereotypes to introduce representation at all, or to push back against those stereotypes. And this is kind of like we had like, so we had like decent representation, then we had like dip, and then we're now back here in terms of how likely are you to run into something that is triggering or hurtful. And again, this is generally just because authors want to deal with these problems because they were hurt by these, these stereotypes and want to be like, no, you don't need to be hurt by that. Ace and error representation in books does not begin or end with Loveless, which, yes, is something that I have seen as late as last year, if not this year. Please, 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 if you want to talk about Aspec representation, especially if you want to cover books, mention more than that one. Just please do. Please do your research. You can find these books fairly easily. My personal bugbear. The other one is the demisexual representation as an excuse to be queerphobic. But those are my major bugbears in these periods. And the main takeaway that I hope people will take from this video is that Aspec publishing remains strong and diverse, especially when it comes to indie spaces, even though the last slide did not quite really show a lot of indie books because I didn't have that many. I do know they're out there. I think, did I mention this? I don't remember if I mentioned this. Apologies if I did. But Indie Geek Awards does an award specifically for Aspec representation, and there were so many books on there that I had never heard of for this year's award, and that was really cool. Like, there is so much more out there than you think or realize. And I know about like 400 books maybe, and which in the giant ocean that is publishing is like a tenth, maybe a tenth of a drop, like a drop of a drop. It's not a lot, but for individual readers it is a lot. And yeah, so thank you very much for sticking with me. Thank you very much for watching. I left a space here for a different video that you can watch if you want to. And yeah, I should probably do that. If you like this video, like, subscribe. You can visit my Patreon, buy some of my books, all that stuff. Not really great at the marketing bit. I'm just here to geek about books, but you can do all of that. So hopefully until next time, I hope you have a lovely time. And until then, bye!